So we are now starting the second panel of the afternoon that is going to be about exploring solutions on addressing the risks of high-THC cannabis products. And we are going to start with Dr. Wayne Hall. He's emeritus professor from Australia. And before starting to that, sorry, it's been a long day already. Who's going to do the introductions is going to be our newest member of the Liquor Cannabis Board, Jim Vollendroff. Kindly agreed to introduce all the speakers, and and also introduce the moderator. Sorry. Okay, let's go.
Great, thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be here today. I just want to add my own welcome on behalf of the Washington State Liquor and Cannabis Board. Our board chair, David Postman, and Ollie Garrett, the other board member, and then our director, Rick Garza, who was here earlier in person but had to head back to Olympia. So thank you so much for the invitation to be here. So our first speaker, Wayne Hall, with over 160 published papers about cannabis, Dr. Hall is internationally recognized for his research on the health effects and public policy responses to cannabis. He's a former professor at the National Center for Youth Substance Use Research at the University of Queensland and was a professor at the National Addiction Center, King's College and London, among other things, and many other professional accomplishments that are outlined in his bio. So please join me in welcoming Wayne Hall.
Thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks to Bea and colleagues for the invitation to speak today. I'm going to talk about a paper that has been published that was led by a postdoctoral fellow who works with me, Dr. Jani Lung, and the references for these papers will be provided at the end of the talk. Next slide, please. I think we can probably just skip this slide because this information has been well presented by other speakers, and just get to the main point of this presentation, which is the extent to which users in markets where more concentrated cannabis products are available are able and in fact do titrate their doses of THC when using more potent products. And obviously, if people are not fully titrating their doses or not titrating at all, there would be major reasons for concern about increased prevalence of acute adverse effects, such as accidents, acute adverse reactions that might take people to an emergency department, and psychotic symptoms. There's also major concerns about chronic adverse outcomes that could potentially increase if people are using these more potent products more frequently, foremost among which would be cannabis dependence, psychosis, depression, cognitive impairment, and educational underachievement. Next slide, please. Jani Lung and I and other colleagues went looking for literature on dose titration because it's often said, particularly by the cannabis industry, that there's no big deal that people are using more potent products because users will titrate their doses and to maintain the same THC dose that they would have got if they'd been using less potent products. And what we discovered in doing literature searches is there's surprisingly little literature on this topic, and a lot of it is very dated. And I'll go through each of these study types, beginning from the next slide, please, with experimental laboratory studies. These have been studies in which samples, typically of relatively experienced cannabis users, have been asked under double-blind conditions to smoke or more recently vape cannabis products, usually herbal cannabis, that differed in its THC content, and to do so in a way that ensured that they maintained or obtained their typical dose of THC. These studies report, unsurprisingly, that people take fewer, shallower puffs when smoking cannabis that they perceive to be more potent. But in some studies, some of these individuals did nonetheless achieve higher levels of THC in blood when they were using more potent products, suggesting that the titration of dose was not complete. And in some studies, they also reported larger effects or subjective effects of using more potent cannabis. The other major limitations of a lot of these studies is that the THC content, and I think this is a point that was made by Deborah Hassin and her talk, is that the potency of what counted as high potency cannabis in a lot of these studies was way below the doses that are typically available in legal markets in the US now. Next overhead, please. There's been a number of naturalistic observational studies, primarily from the Netherlands, where regular cannabis users have been observed in their usual surroundings when using more or less potent cannabis. And these studies have obtained self-reports on the effects of cannabis, and some have measured THC levels in blood. Again, the evidence suggests some dose titration, but incomplete. People do use different smoking topography, that is, they vary the number of puffs and how deep they are, and there are often no difference in self-reported effects of more or less potent cannabis. But in some of these studies, the people smoking the more potent cannabis did obtain larger doses of THC. Next slide, please. The weakest type of evidence is what cannabis users report about their behaviour when using more or less potent cannabis, and we've got two studies of this type, one from San Francisco and one from the Netherlands. In the San Francisco study, 2/3 of people reported that they used smaller amounts of more potent cannabis when that was available, but there were no measures taken of cannabis effects or observations of their behaviour. A survey of customers of cannabis cafes in the Netherlands asked them how they behave when using more potent cannabis products. A small minority of this group preferred to use lower doses of more potent product. Younger, more dependent users used more of the high-potency cannabis, and older users who were typically heavy daily users and had been for a long time didn't bother adjusting their dose at all, suggesting that in this is a sort of sample at least that titration was a minority practice. Next overhead, please. The other evidence that we have is not so much looking at what people do, but looking at the associations between self-reported potency of cannabis used and various adverse events. And we've already heard a good summary of the work of DeForty and colleagues in London, showing higher rates of psychotic symptoms in the incidence of psychoses, I should say, in people who are using more higher potency cannabis products. We've also seen in the Global Drug Survey, a large survey of very experienced users of a variety of illicit drugs, that people who report using a higher potency cannabis report more symptoms of dependence than people who use less potent cannabis. And we've seen similar work at Freeman and Winstock from the Global Drug Survey suggesting that people who use the higher potency cannabis products report more psychological distress than people who use lower potent. Because the difficulty in the latter type of studies, the cross-sectional surveys, is the potency a cause or an effect, or an effect in the sense that it might reflect user preferences rather than a specific effect of the cannabis itself. Next overhead, please. We also have ecological associations between cannabis potency and problems. This is important. I think it was a point David Hammond made in his talk. We can talk about titration occurring at an individual level, but we could also need to ask the question, across a population, how many people titrate their doses or not? And we've got a variety of studies suggesting that when more potent cannabis is more widely used in a population, the more problems. These are ecological, they're not data on individuals, they're looking at the prevalence of particular problems as a function of increased availability of more potent cannabis. And one of these studies was Tom Freeman and colleagues, where they were able to show, interestingly, that the incidence of people seeking treatment in the Netherlands for cannabis use disorders increased as the potency of cannabis flower increased. But more interestingly, when regulators encouraged coffee shops to sell cannabis with a potency or THC content below 15%, the incidence of people attending treatment services for cannabis use disorders decreased. And we've seen a variety of studies more recently from Canada, from Ontario, emergency department attendances, showing that the prevalence of attendances for adverse effects of cannabis has increased as cannabis extracts availability has increased. Next slide, please. This is the work of Myron and colleagues showing an increase in the prevalence of attendances at emergency departments in the province of Ontario as a function of the increased commercialisation and increased sale of higher potency cannabis products. Next slide, please. So how do we put this evidence together? Well, I think the obvious point is that it's all pretty weak and there's not a lot of strong evidence one way or another as to whether users titrate their doses. There's some suggestion, I guess, from the laboratory studies, which is the best, that some users can titrate their doses when they're asked to do so, but their adjustment of dose may be far from complete. There are too few naturalistic studies to assess if users, in fact, do titrate their doses in the wild, as it were, as against in the laboratory. And there's a variety of suggestive survey evidence that people who use more potent products report more problems, and ecological associations between population use of higher potency cannabis products and increased treatment seeking for cannabis dependence and psychoses. The major limitation of a lot of this data is that it's of uncertain relevance to the current situations we see in the US and also in Canada, where the potency or the THC content of a lot of cannabis products that are routinely sold is a great deal, an order of magnitude almost greater than the sorts of levels that were studied in a lot of the older literature. So clearly much better data on the role of cannabis potency and the extent to which users can and do titrate their doses should be a public health priority. Next slide, please. So what sort of research do we need? Well, we need much better laboratory and observational studies with much larger samples using the higher potency cannabis flower, oils and concentrates that are now available. And I appreciate the unique difficulties of doing any of this work in the US given the continuation of federal prohibition. It's probably something that could be more easily done in Canada, where federal legalisation has occurred. And we certainly need to be measuring the THC doses that users receive in a lot of these studies. And we need the sort of work that David Hammond so well summarised in a presentation earlier today, large-scale surveys of consumers of the very different cannabis products that are around, to better understand who chooses to use these, how they use these products, to measure the extent of the development of tolerance and dependence, and measures of cognitive performance and various symptoms of mental health disorders. But also critically, how people perform in everyday life. Is their ability to meet the demands of everyday life impaired as a consequence of using higher potency products? Next slide, please. So do we have to wait for the better research before we work out policy responses? Well, I think the answer here critically depends on who bears the burden of proof. Is it the cannabis industry to demonstrate that these products don't increase harm, or is the burden on policymakers to show that they do increase harm? I think the burden should be on the industry, and for a variety of reasons. And I think it's a point that was already made in the panel discussion before the break. So the citizens of Washington State and other US states who voted to legalise cannabis weren't aware when they were doing that they were opening up the market for these highly concentrated THC cannabis products that are now beginning to assume or consume a fair proportion of the sales in legal markets. I think also critically, the mantra of the advocates for legalisation as being we should regulate cannabis like alcohol, in which case stricter policies would be well justified, I think. We don't allow people to sell 90% ethanol products in liquor outlets or bars. States often restrict where spirits can be sold, and governments often impose higher taxes on higher alcohol beverages for very good reasons. And I think for similar reasons, we could argue that the same sorts of justifications exist for better regulation of the potency of cannabis products in legal markets. Next slide, please. So some of these regulatory options have already been canvassed. Obviously, the one option, as implemented in Quebec, the province of Quebec in Canada, is to impose a ban on the sale of high-potency cannabis extracts. The industry, of course, tends to resort to play the black market card, that this will increase do-it-yourself cannabis extraction and with an increased fires and residues in illicit market products. And as I think David Hammond has suggested from the data available to date from Quebec, that this hasn't appeared to be a major problem in that province. We can put a cap on THC content of legal cannabis products. We can argue about what the THC level might be, and 30% is the level that's been chosen in Quebec, might be a reasonably defensible level. The Netherlands proposed at 15%, and I guess that's something that research evidence might be useful in deciding. Of course, this induces costs for producers and regulators in enforcing the cap, and there may be some incentives there for illicit production and supply of concentrates above these sorts of levels. But I think, again, the Quebec experience suggests that prohibition doesn't in and of itself produce large-scale problems if there are other products that people are prepared to purchase and that are legally available. We can also consider, as has been advocated, graduated cannabis taxes based on the THC content of products as now is in place in Canada. And the analogy here would be very directly with that of alcohol-based taxes. The regulatory costs of this would be pretty much similar to those requiring accurate labelling of THC content of products in a legal market. So it's hard to see that this would entail additional costs. Next one, please. So just leave that up. These are some of the key references that I've cited. The Long et al. Review is what I've just summarised largely in the talk, and there are some of the other key references that I've cited in the course of the talk. So thanks very much, and I look forward to questions and discussion at the end of our session.
So in a prior life, I was the director of the Behavioral Health Division for King County, and as such, I was responsible for a lot of policy development. And so I had the pleasure of meeting our next speaker about 2 months ago at a Canara meeting and was immediately became a fan. So I'm pleased to introduce our next speaker, Gillian Schauer. Dr. Schauer is the Executive Director of the Cannabis Regulators Association, which among other things shares best practice policy approaches between government officials. She has worked in public health and drug policy for nearly 2 decades and has a decade of experience working on the federal state agencies on cannabis policy, data monitoring, and research translation. So please join me in welcoming her. And I'll remind everybody that we're going to have questions at the end of the presentations today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone, for staying. I know it's been a long day with lots of information, so appreciate that you're still here and in your seats. So I think where Dr. Hall left off is where I'm going to pick up. So I'm going to focus on telling you what are U.S. states actually doing in terms of policy in this arena right now. Just quickly, I don't have any funding to disclose. This presentation's my own. I am going to present some pretty factual policy implementation information, and then at the end I'm going to talk about some challenges. I will be using some of my own opinions when I talk about the challenges and want to make that clear. A brief overview of the Cannabis Regulators Association. We're a national, nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. All of our members are government officials. We convene government officials involved in cannabis regulation from more than 40 states and territories. We are not an advocacy group. We do not endorse or oppose particular policies or legislation. Our mission and goals are primarily around an exchange of information, working towards best practices that safeguard public health and safety, safety, promote equity, and promote regulatory certainty for industry participants. We have more than a dozen committees that focus on a range of topics, including a public health committee that has had a number of discussions on this particular topic of THC concentration. And I'm going to use the term THC concentration. I think that's a better marker of what we're talking about here. There's a lot of tendency to use the term potency. For me, potency means how much of a product you need to achieve a certain effect. And I think the policies I'm talking about are really more about how much THC is in the product. We're funded primarily by member agencies. We have no non-government membership. So I've gotten the privilege of working really closely with regulatory agencies across the country, and they all have different missions and guiding principles, but I think there are some commonalities. So this is a generalization, but I put this up because I think this illustrates the challenge of THC concentration for a regulatory agency. Generally, regulatory agencies focused on cannabis are focused on consumer safety, broader public health and safety, promoting equity, market stability, and economic growth. And when we look at THC concentration as an issue, it has implications for a lot of these different areas, and that may contraindicate movement in one space or another. So I'm going to be presenting data on adult use cannabis states. There's a whole separate presentation I could give on what medical states are doing in this space, but I think adult use states are most relevant to Washington's discussion. So this is a list of all the adult use states that have legalized. You can see when they legalized, and you can see the delay between legalization and when the market opened. And I think it's important to show this in part because a lot of folks may misunderstand and think that regulators can very easily and quickly change policy on a matter. And as you see, a lot of policy in cannabis is increasingly being made legislatively, and almost all of the policy I'm about to present to you with regard to THC concentration has been made by legislatures. Typically, regulators can be quite involved in that process, depends on the state, but it's not something that's happening in rulemaking, and so I think that's an important distinction. So I'm going to focus in on what kinds of policies do adult use states have in place that can impact high THC products. I'm not going to present data from states like Rhode Island that just legalized and doesn't yet have rules in place, or DC, for example, where they don't have a market open. So I'm going to start with THC caps. I think this is where I've personally seen the most legislative activity across states. The idea behind this is you are capping the amount of THC that can be concentrated in a product. Connecticut and Vermont are currently the only states that have THC caps in place. They both look very similar. In both states, THC flower is limited to 30% THC on a dry weight basis. Anyone who knows cannabis knows that that's about the maximum threshold for flower anyway, so the cap isn't effectively changing that much in terms of the products that are available. Other cannabis products are limited to no more than 60% THC. They exempt pre-filled vape cartridges. I don't know exactly what the legislatures were thinking when they passed these laws, but my guess is that the vaping lung injury outbreak may have played a role here, and I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of the presentation. But effectively, they have a 60% cap of THC on solid concentrates, and that is also an effective ban. You can manufacture something like rosin at 60% THC. You cannot manufacture most of the concentrate products that we're talking about, shatter, wax. You can't manufacture this at 60% THC, so that's effectively a ban. Neither one of these markets are yet open. Potential limitations that may have public health consequences that have been raised include some of what we've already heard today. This effectively outlaws most THC concentrates and has unknown illicit market implications. The eastern states look very different in geography than Canada. Canadian provinces are much more widely dispersed, and it's very easy in a matter of an hour to drive from one East Coast state to another, and there are a number of East Coast states that have concentrates. So I personally hope lots of researchers are going to look at this and figure out, is there a lot of, what Dr. Calkins talked about this morning, sort of cross-state transactions happening? What is the effect of this on consumers in these states, if any? And then people have also raised a concern that this kind of policy could incentivize home production of concentrates, which is a felony in the state of Oregon because of the risk that brings, the solvents that are used, the fire hazard. So it'll be very interesting to watch what happens in Connecticut and Vermont as their markets open. And again, I hope researchers are paying close attention. In terms of serving size or package size, this is another policy approach. And this is the policy approach. I'm not talking about edibles today, but this is the policy approach that's been taken with edibles, quite effectively, I might add. All adult use states have a 5 milligram or 10 milligram serving size for edibles with package limits. So what do we see for THC concentrates? Well, nothing. And in fact, some of the new states have taken some steps here. We see states like California and Washington where there's a single serving size limit or a per package limit of 1,000 milligrams of THC for concentrates. We see Colorado taking a very different approach. Colorado has recommended a visual serving for concentrates, and they've recommended a serving for vaped concentrate cannabis that's 2 seconds of inhalation. Here's the visual representation of Colorado's serving size. They actually have a tangible educational resource that is required to be delivered at the point of sale that shows the consumer this is what a serving size should be. And I'll talk a little bit more about more of the Colorado policy as it's quite new. New Jersey, which is just launching their market, their policy is that a single serving of any cannabis product, whether it's a concentrate or an edible or anything else, is limited to 10 milligrams of THC or the equivalent weight as determined based on THC potency. Nevada, more similar to California and Washington, total THC is limited to 800 milligrams per package. And then Vermont has a per package limitation that's quite different than some of the earlier states to legalize. Theirs is 50 milligrams of THC per package, regardless of the product type. Again, I'll remind you though, Vermont's policy basically eliminates or bans concentrates. A number of states require packages to denote what the serving size is, even if they don't require a serving size, and or to denote the number of servings that are included. So what do we see in terms of purchase limits for THC or concentrates? Well, in a lot of states, purchase limits are basically equivalent to possession limits. So you can't purchase more than you're allowed to possess. As such, the ranges can be quite high in terms of quantity. For flower, we see possession and or purchase limits range from 1 to 3 ounces across adult use states. And for concentrates, they are not even measured in the same unit. We see everything from Illinois that has a 500 milligram THC purchase limit, and Nevada where it's a 3.5 gram concentrate limit, to 24 grams in New York. Specific packaging and labeling requirements for concentrates. So this is another potential policy area to explore. In terms of packaging, Colorado is a state that has some packaging limits. Again, remember their sort of visual serving size. So what they add to that visual serving size is if a product cannot be easily separated or measured in the recommended visual serving, the container must have a measuring device and must include labeling with instructions on how to measure. Again, they're in the process of rolling this out, so it'll be interesting to follow up with them and see the effect of that for consumers. In terms of labeling, Nevada has a requirement that usable cannabis must be listed in terms of the concentration of total THC overall, milligrams per package, and as a percentage. And that might seem like something that you'd expect to find on every label, but in fact, that's not a requirement across all states, and that may have some consumer effects in terms of listing in 2 different forms. New Jersey has taken a really innovative approach. Again, their market's not open, so we'll have to see how it works, but their rules and statutes state that all finished cannabis product labels must contain chemotypes, denoting whether it's high THC, low THC, high CBD, low CBD. So you can see their high THC, low CBD is a ratio of greater than 5:1. Their moderate is a ratio of between 5:1 and 1:5, and their low THC, high CBD is a ratio of less than 1:5, where the total THC is less than 5%. So again, will be very interesting to study what does this do for consumers, how do they understand this, does this change behavior at all? In terms of warning labels, which is also a labeling intervention that could be undertaken, we have, again, Colorado, Nevada, and New Jersey requiring something related to THC concentration or effects. So Colorado's required label has a provision that states there may be long-term physical or mental health risks from the use of marijuana. And then they also require this tangible resource, which I'll show on the screen in more full on the next slide, so you can see some of the warnings that are not on the package, but must be disseminated at the point of sale. In Nevada, the warning must state that there may be mental or physical health risks associated with consumption of cannabis or cannabis products, including but not limited to cardiovascular problems, psychosis, or exacerbation of anxiety or depression. And then New Jersey is the only state that has a specific labeling requirement for high THC products. So if the product has more than 40% THC, by concentration, the warning must state, this is a high potency product and may increase your risk for psychosis. That warning must be printed in no less than 10-point font on the front of the package. It may not wrap around the side of the package. In terms of point of sale education about concentrates, 2 states are doing something there. Colorado, again, a pretty new rollout of legislation that passed last year. Retailers are required to provide this tangible educational resource at the point of sale. And it's probably hard to read. I'm happy to provide it to Bia so that folks can see it after. But there's a whole section on warnings related to consuming concentrates via inhalation, effects, et cetera. So it's worth taking a look at. I think the enforcement question is a big one here. Who's going to be enforcing whether it's disseminated? What's going to happen with that? And then in Nevada, retailers are required to post the warnings that I just read at the point of sale as well. And then THC-based tax approaches, which Dr. Hall mentioned as an option. There are 3 states experimenting with that: Connecticut, Illinois, and New York. Illinois has been at it the longest, so I'll start with theirs because their market has been open for a couple years. Their tax structure is a tiered structure. So cannabis products with a Delta 9 THC level at or below 35% are taxed at 10% of the purchase price. Cannabis-infused products, which would be edibles, are taxed at a rate of 20%, and cannabis other than infused cannabis products, so those would be concentrates, with a Delta 9 THC level above 35%, are taxed at a rate of 25% the price of purchase. I will state that this can be a bit challenging to enforce, so this type of a tax structure really needs to have an accompanying enforcement plan. Connecticut and New York have taken a bit of a different approach. Both of those states are going to be implementing a tax per milligram of THC. It's not exactly the same, though. Connecticut's follows a bit more of what we see with Illinois, where the tax is slightly different, whether it's plant material, edibles, or concentrates. It's a point of sale tax, and it will depend on the milligrams of THC in the product. New York's is also a per milligram tax on concentrate products, but it will be attributed at the wholesale level. So again, that's another natural experiment happening in the East Coast. What's the effect of a consumer getting a receipt that shows they paid more tax because they bought a higher THC product? Will they even know that in New York when it's a wholesale tax? So lots to study there. There are a number of other policies that could be considered to address concentrates in adult use states: age limitations related to concentrates, advertising limitations related to concentrates, complete overt product class bans on concentrates. We don't see any states that have undertaken these yet. So shifting to think about some of the challenges related to regulation of high THC products and some of the challenging environment that I think lawmakers and regulators alike face. We've heard a lot today about the research that's out there. I'll just say for policymakers, I still think it's insufficient scientific research. Most of the research that exists is based on, as we heard earlier, THC, that's less than 10%, which is virtually every product on a legal adult use market. So that makes it very hard to interpret what's the true impact of concentrates as a class. There are also a lack of studies about the impact of different potential policy levers on consumer behavior or youth access. So I just presented a lot of what states are trying. We don't yet know if those policy levers will actually affect the outcomes that are of concern here. This is a complex topic with implications for a lot of different outcomes: mental health, public health outcomes, illicit market outcomes, which can also have extremely negative public health consequences, and outcomes that are important as we are in the wake of the vaping lung injury outbreak. We have a lack of federal resources helping states right now to identify safety profiles on things like additives or manufacturing methods. There's no approved list of ingredients. So for those of you who might have forgotten about the vaping lung injury outbreak, it peaked in 2019, nearly 70 confirmed deaths across a number of states, hospitalizations in all states. It was largely from illicit products that were from informal sources, and one of the attributable agents was an additive, vitamin E acetate. And there are a number of other additives that could have concerning health and safety profiles, and states are not given information on what is a safe additive by agencies like FDA. today. So one of the things that I would advise any policymaker is think carefully about the policy and what unintended consequences could be. So a lot of the discussion about caps, I mentioned Connecticut and Vermont both exempt vaping products. One of the reasons for that may be a concern that if you limit a vaping product to 60% THC, you're effectively saying 40% of that product has to be other additives that could have unknown public health consequences. So I think there's a lot to think about and unpack here, and certainly unintended consequences needs to be a consideration. In conclusion, what are the public policy implications? I think there's an absence of science to guide policy making here, which makes this a particularly challenging topic and is one of the reasons that we're all here. It would be great if NIDA and the federal government would make doing research easier, because part of the problem is people can't actually conduct research with the products that are being sold in state markets right now. U.S. states are implementing a range of different policy approaches to try to address THC concentrates and their public health outcomes. These policy approaches are typically initiated through legislatures. They're not typically coming from regulators or regulatory agencies, and they've not been evaluated to assess whether or not they'll affect the outcomes that we need them to affect. As an organization, CANRA continues to facilitate multi-state discussions about these approaches, and will continue to do so, and I will just say benefits greatly from researchers that are doing work in this space, and I'll continue to be reaching out to researchers to make sure that policymakers and regulators alike are hearing the latest research to try to inform things. And hopefully I've given some of the researchers in the audience some ideas of future studies that could be conducted, particularly on the East Coast. That's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Schauer. Your slide on challenges related to regulations on high THC products alone was an entire conversation that I'd love to follow up on at some point. Our next speaker, Denise Walker. Dr. Walker is a research professor in the University of Washington, director of the Innovative Programs Research Group, and is a licensed clinical psychologist. A main area of her research expertise is on the development and evaluation of interventions for cannabis disorders for both adults and adolescents. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Walker.
It's a long walk. Okay. Does that work? That's good? Okay. Okay, so thank you for having me. I'm going to be talking about high THC concentration and its impact for young adults with psychosis. Really kind of building on Dr. Hason's talk, but also really trying to hone in on this implications for intervention with this population. But first, I'd like to thank my co-investigators in this work. So a good chunk of my work is on cannabis intervention, development, and evaluation. Psychosis is a new area for me, and I'm working with Drs. Monroe, DeVita, and Petros in this work, and we were recently funded by the Royalty Research Fund to do some of the work that I'll be describing. I also wanted to kind of get on the same page as far as what do I mean by psychosis. Psychosis is a state where there is some kind of a disconnect from reality. So folks, the typical kinds of things that you hear about are when people are seeing or hearing or feeling things that aren't there, or they're having false beliefs, something that we call clinically a delusion. Psychotic episodes are when people are ill in this way, and psychosis can be both temporary or chronic. So as far as transient or temporary psychosis goes, oftentimes it can be induced by things like sleep deprivation, substances of abuse, including cannabis, can absolutely induce a temporary form of psychosis in some people. When it stays around longer, for days, for weeks, then we need to start thinking about schizophrenia type disorder diagnosis. Some mood disorders also have psychosis features, major depression being one of them. In the United States, over 10 million folks experience a psychotic disorder. And the far majority of those folks experience their first episode of psychosis before the age of 25. So young adulthood is definitely a risky time for the development of psychosis. We also know it's a risky time for the development of cannabis use disorder. Cannabis use is highly prevalent among this population. About 35 to 45% of young adults experiencing psychosis use cannabis. There are some research, like experimental studies, that have suggested and demonstrated that young adults with psychosis actually experience the high of cannabis differently or more intensely, more pleasurable than the general population. And I think this may be one contributing factor to the fact that we also see rates of cannabis use disorder in this population at a much higher rate than the general population. So 1 in 4, or 25% of young adults with psychosis meet criteria for cannabis use disorder, but only 5% of the general population of 18 to 25-year-olds meet cannabis use disorder criteria. So cannabis is prevalent among psychosis populations, both use and cannabis use disorders. Dr. Hayson did a great job of explaining how cannabis use can actually be a risk factor in the development of psychosis, and there is longitudinal and cross-sectional studies both in the US and internationally now that have really suggested that cannabis is a risk factor for the development of psychosis. And it seems like now we have a few studies that have really suggested that incident rates of psychosis are increasing kind of in tandem with the availability of high THC products. Dr. Hayson made this very clear that daily high potency use increases risk of development of psychosis. So the three things that we really have to worry about or be concerned about with cannabis's relationship with the development of psychosis are using super frequently, high frequency of use, using high potency cannabis, which, as many of the speakers have already discussed, is problematic because it's been defined as basically 10 to 12% potency, but also using earlier in life, in adolescence. We also know that cannabis impacts treatment for folks who are affected. So in a lot of really detrimental ways. So when folks are experiencing psychosis and have a diagnosis and are undergoing treatment, persistent cannabis use is associated with more severe positive symptoms and negative symptoms, higher rates of relapse and rehospitalizations. We also know that it's related to poor psychosocial functioning and recovery from psychosis. And then also poor adherence to antipsychotic medications and an increase in mental health treatment dropout. Two things that are really imperative for folks with these kinds of disorders. They need to be in treatment, they need to be taking medications, oftentimes to be stabilized. This is important because schizophrenia has no cure. It's lifelong, it's debilitating. Many, who are experiencing schizophrenia-form disorders are not working. It's something that you don't want to have necessarily, and it's something that stays with you your entire life. Relapse is associated with poor functional and psychosocial outcomes. So when people relapse or are rehospitalized, this is not good for them over the course of the long term. So it's not good for their recovery, but it's also incredibly expensive for us as a society. One study estimated that just the cost, not the cost of psychosis generally, which was over $100 billion in the US, but just the cost of relapse and rehospitalization was over $37 billion in the year of 2013 in the US. Experts agree that cannabis is one of the preventable causes of psychosis relapse. So all of this really suggests that there's an urgent need to develop interventions for this population to address cannabis use. And what we know, unfortunately, from providers in studies is that they oftentimes feel ill-equipped to deal with this issue with their patient populations. They might feel more comfortable about talking with or addressing alcohol use with their patients and less so about cannabis. They want more evidence-based educational materials, specifically addressing cannabis. And we found this in our own work here in Washington State. We surveyed Washington State providers who serve young adults with psychosis. And what we found was that they said they need, that cannabis interventions are extremely needed, they are extremely important, and they only feel a little bit or somewhat prepared to address this with their patients. So at this point, we know evidence-based intervention has been identified specifically for working with psychosis. On the other hand, in the general population, we have several efficacious interventions that have been identified that work, that are effective. Motivational enhancement therapy is one of those interventions that's been tested across populations and age groups to treat and intervene with cannabis. For adolescents, for college students, for adults. It's been applied to pre-treatment, so folks who are not necessarily interested in changing their cannabis use, but it's also been applied as a treatment for cannabis use disorder and to help people maintain gains that they've made in treatment. It has not, at this point, been tested with young adults with psychosis. So some of our work, we were interested in trying to figure out, what from 3 stakeholder groups, young adults with psychosis who use cannabis, their providers and family members, what kinds of adaptations were really necessary for a cannabis use intervention for this population. We did focus groups, 8 focus groups with those 3 stakeholder groups. And we were really interested in trying to just inform that development and adaptation of a combined cannabis intervention. We were interested in thinking about adapting motivational enhancement therapy for the individual, but also trying to figure out how to provide some skills and resources to family members who were oftentimes supporting their young adult in psychosis treatment to help them navigate discussions about cannabis and promote non-use or abstinence or reduced use. What we found from the young adults themselves is one of the things that was really interesting for me I've listened to probably at least 400 therapy sessions with adolescents or adults for cannabis, and the young adults with psychosis sound so similar to all of the clients that I've heard over the years. They use for similar reasons. They use to be social, they use to deal with negative affect, to cope with moods, and they like the high. They like getting high, they like that it's a break. They just like that as an activity. They can also see the benefits of reduction or quitting on their life goals, right? So they understand that at some level it might not be always helpful and there might be some detrimental effects. They also were pretty confused and want more science-based information on cannabis and psychosis and that relationship. Actually across the board, from all 3 stakeholder groups, they were relatively unaware of this relationship between cannabis and psychosis. And these are populations who were actually engaged in treatment for psychosis and using cannabis. They also really had a desire for an individualized intervention, one that was very respectful, non-judgmental, but also tailored to their needs, that really highlighted some of that information that we do know about how cannabis can be risky for them. Families and providers' experiences kind of converged in a number of areas, but one of the things that families talked about and providers echoed in a little bit less of a strong way was that cannabis is a contentious topic between families and their loved ones, for sure. And this can be somewhat contentious between providers and young adults. And one of the things that's really challenging for both the family members and the providers are these mixed messages about cannabis and the social perception that it's not addictive, it's medicine, it's fine. That in and of itself made conversations with young adults with psychosis really challenging and hard to navigate, because they were bombarded with these like, oh, it's fine, it's great, it's healthy messages, when that's not what they were seeing at home and that's not what they were seeing with their clients. They also wanted more science-based information, and they wanted to be able to leverage that and use that to increase their motivation to change. And of course, like, there's also, you know, a bit of a difference. Like, parents and providers definitely were interested in abstinence. If they kind of had their way, they would prefer an abstinence kind of a goal for a young adult. But the young adults oftentimes wanted some leverage. They wanted to be able to use at some level the choice to not have just an abstinence kind of approach. So with regard to intervention implications, I think there are several, but one of the biggest ones is just science-based psychoeducation. All stakeholders wanted that on specifically the risks that cannabis use poses for the maintenance, the relapse, and rehospitalization of this population. Counseling styles should be non-confrontational, non-judgmental. It should be supportive and individualized. And then from the larger literature that I didn't talk about as much, I think harm reduction strategies really do need to be emphasized with this population. There does seem to be better outcomes for folks who are using less, using lower THC products, and using products that have a higher CBD to THC ratio, particularly for those folks who are not ready to quit. I think motivational enhancement therapy is primed to be adapted for this population for a number of reasons, but it's brief, 1 to 4 sessions. It has been delivered in person, over the phone, and via computer. The dominant style is one that's very respectful and autonomy supporting, uses a lot of open-ended questions and reflections and affirmations to draw out that person's own individual motivations to change. But it also is combined with personalized feedback that's provided to that individual based on their assessment results. And that personalized feedback summarizes a number of things. It first compares their use with normative data from the population to see where they compare. But it also summarizes their recent use patterns, the consequences that they've experienced from cannabis, the risk factors for developing cannabis use disorder, and also reviewing their personal goals. This risk factor piece can be really leveraged, I think, for this particular population, given that there are such clear risks to cannabis for recovery and psychosis. So overall, I think motivational enhancement, the whole idea is to facilitate a really honest and candid conversation and exploration of someone's use, including, thinking through with them the costs and benefits of their use, comparing that, how does that look compared to other people, and then also really, diving in and thinking thoughtfully about how their cannabis use is impacting their personal goals, their recovery plan, and also important relationships. I also think our work suggested that families are interested in having more information and being utilized and leveraged as a tool to help young adults with psychosis reduce their use. And that is actually borne out in the literature as well. There was a study done in the Netherlands where people taught family members of youth with psychosis who were also using cannabis. They trained them in communication styles very similar to motivational interviewing to try to help navigate discussions around cannabis in more of a motivational way. And what they found was that intervention, working with the family members, helping them communicate about cannabis with their youth in a different way, actually had an impact on that cannabis use. So as far as policy implications and practice implications as well, I think that, this population really requires us to think about potency limits and decreasing access to high-potency THC, specifically for youth, for a number of reasons, but this is one of them. We need to develop and test more cannabis interventions specifically for this population. And we also need to be potentially recommending harm reduction strategies that are hopeful for this population. I recently had the intervention that we developed is called the Teen Marijuana Checkup. I had a session with a client who was a young adult in a psychosis program, and it was fascinating. He was talking about how, at the beginning of treatment, he was using like all day, every day. He was not doing well with his symptoms. He had not doing well in his relationships, not functioning well at all. They made a plan to figure out he was going to use every other day, and he was going to use a certain amount of edibles, and that was it. And it was amazing what that difference made on his recovery and his stabilization. So I think some of these things can be really important for practitioners to know. Also, I think some of these have already been talked about in different talks, but increase the awareness of the connection between cannabis and psychosis. People don't know about this. If we have people, in focus groups who have family members or have themselves a psychotic disorder and are using cannabis, and they don't know about the risks that cannabis poses to this population, you would think that they of all people would know, but they don't. So it's similar for the public and providers. They need more information about this. I also think there needs to be stricter requirements for medical card authorizations for cannabis for those with psychosis. And I also think that the literature really suggests that we need to be screening youth with cannabis use disorder for psychosis disorders or high-risk clinical high risk for psychosis, and vice versa. For folks who are clinical high risk for psychosis or experiencing psychosis, we need to screen for cannabis use disorders. And that is all I have today.
Thank you, Dr. Walker. Another really informative presentation. I really love that you talked about the role of family interventions and harm reduction as a part of your presentation. The benefit of coming to presentations like this and symposiums is there's so many great people that I get introduced to, so I'll be following up with so many of you after today. Our final presenter for this session, before the Q&A session, is Dr. Beatriz Carlini. I was introduced to Dr. Carlini by Representative Davis, and like Representative Davis, I've become a big fan. As you've already heard, she was instrumental in bringing us together and organizing today's event, and I am personally thankful for your efforts and really impressed with what I've seen today. Dr. Carlini has been a pioneer on bringing awareness on the sharp increase in the availability and risks of high-potency or high THC content products. She is an associate professor for the University of Washington Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, and has been dedicated to understanding the public health impact of legal psychoactive substances use and policies on social and health outcomes. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Carlini.
Thank you, Jim, for the kind introduction. I started my day today so stressed that I went to the wrong hotel to wait for the keynote speaker to take him for coffee. But things kind of moved in the right direction, I hope. So I hope I can survive my presentation at the end of the day, and most importantly, you can survive. So what I bring into you today is, well, what Washington stakeholders think of all that we talked about today. And just to give you a background of why we are bringing this topic now at the end, as it was mentioned here, ADAI has been contracted by Healthcare Authority to a legislative proviso to write policy recommendations in a report to Washington legislature. This is due to the end of this calendar year. So the recommendations will be based, as it might be mentioned already, not, of course, in research evidence, what kind of policy works in several areas that had similar challenges. In the North America context, that basically Gillian Schauer made all the homework ready for us, and also, of course, in what local stakeholders think about this issue. So why talk about stakeholders? I mean, it's kind of it's stressing what is already obvious for most of us here, that the best research-based evidence can be put forward, and if stakeholders are ignored on their rights, their opinion, their perspectives, basically you have no success of implementing such policy. So the brightest ideas can not be implemented or not be sustainable if you don't involve stakeholders and hear where they sit on all the ideas that you think are the brightest solution to the world because science back up. So that's the idea of engaging stakeholders, and we use scientific methods to hear from them. So let's start on our research and our study where we found the stakeholders that we have studied. We used channels we in great part already had with 30 years of work. ADAI had collected a lot of emails from important stakeholders from all different perspectives, approach, and walk of life. We reached them through these emails, listservs, presentation at various forums, LCB, DBHR, and other forums. We reach out to the cannabis industry, to journals and associations, and also selected social media. And we got the main stakeholders we were looking for. We divided them in 3 big groups. So the first group were communities. These are screenshots of the online forum that we set up for our study. Among them we had prevention, social justice, and youth-centered organizations, parents, educators, and youth. We got also professionals that include healthcare providers, law enforcement, government agencies, and researchers. And another group that we called cannabis advocates. There were people that worked in the industry, were representatives of the industry, or were on press funded by industry, or also people that having several identities in life, decided to, in this study, to use their identity as cannabis consumers. Once we reach, and you're going to see the numbers in a minute, what we ask them. So we had a 2 round of questions to the stakeholders in our study. So first we said, hey, come on with ideas. What do you think? In your opinion, how can our laws about high-THC cannabis products be strengthened in Washington State to decrease risk to consumers? So it's a really open book for people to jot down ideas. We ask for 3 ideas, and then we keep probing for more, and just feel freely, don't think much, just get our ideas, your ideas to us. And with this strategy, we got 302 ideas, and we are gladly reporting to you, there are not 302 ways of addressing this issue. A lot of them were repeats, a lot of them were redundant, as it is expected to be. So we worked with Polygon Inc., which is the company that helped us to navigate all the process of putting this study together to consolidate the repeats and the redundancy to avoid bias, and then we just validated their findings. And they we decided for 46 unique policy ideas coming from this brainstorm process. So then we did, again, a whole process of recruitment. So this brainstorm phase was open for about 3 weeks. Open online, was made primarily for cell phone, mobile applications, but also on traditional computers. The second phase, we did, again, our recruitment and asked for a second set of procedures. First, we said, hey, these are the 46 ideas, and could you please group them? And this is again a screenshot, so they would get, this is a random idea there, so can you put color code and group them and make different groups for us? And then the second, we asked, okay, get these 46 ideas, and there was a way that they could move with their fingers, if it was a cell phone or their computer, move to 1 to 10, whether or not they thought each of these different ideas were first, impactful or not on addressing the issue at hand, and second, if they were approved, was it possible to implement, how feasible they were. I would love to say that we came up with all these ideas, but no, this is actually an approach, a methodological approach called concept mapping, which is a method of having a way to capture collective thinking to find policy solutions. I haven't seen this much in drug policy, but it's very much used for urban development decisions and healthcare services. It's an approach that is different from a lot of things we have been seeing in our state. It's equitable and is a participatory approach that people don't necessarily have a hierarchy to show when they are participating. Their input is done anonymous. There are 2 rounds of participation. And it was very exciting for us to apply this approach in our evaluation of stakeholders in Washington. Who we got when we did this procedure. So we got 109 participants in the first phase, brainstorm, the second 160. Some of them were the same, some were not. Hard to know. This is all anonymous input. What we do know is it's not common to have this amount of participation when you are trying to get people involved on making decisions on policy and giving their opinion. So this is a very successful amount of participation for this kind of process. We got a demographically diverse group, and this is the first phase and the second phase, very similar. And we also could see that although they were not identical in percentage of participation, cannabis and community and professionals participating well in the 2 phases of our study. The other thing that we also saw is like, what about the geographic distribution? Are we going to have just King County, which for out-of-towners, and Thurston County that are the west side of our state? You could see that no, there was wide participation. Each of different color is a different county in Washington, although the most populous areas, yes, had more participation. Probably proportional with the demographic distribution, we got good participation for all sides. We also decided to measure, and thanks for Dr. Gillian Schauer for suggesting this question, are people that were involved in our study really concerned about high level of THC, and they had from 1 to 5 to point out their level of concern. As you can see on the bottom, you have the red marker that shows that 3.8 was the average concern, which is pretty high. We can see also that many stakeholders had even higher concern about the issue of high-THC cannabis. Consumers themselves had a pretty moderate concern, so they were around 2.8. And the industry was around 1.4. What did we find? Okay, so that's a little tricky. It's a lot of details, so I hope you can, don't fall asleep in the middle. So just to remind, first people had to sort in group and color code the ideas. And that's what we got. So there were 7 policy areas that they divided in big buckets, this 46, so from age restrictions to ban high THC altogether, empower consumers, and so on. And there was an 8th option that was present in our brainstorm phase and moved to the second phase, that is do nothing. The do nothing means things are good as they are. So let's see, and then they had to do something else. They had, as you remembered and you recall, to get to rate infeasibility and impact. So that provided us a quadrant that our results just show like this, and I promise I won't stop now. I'm going to explain what this means. So what this means is when we want people we want to prioritize, or stakeholders want to prioritize what they found feasible and impactful, which is the right upper quadrant. And so on, they may find it is very, so let make it easier here, they may find it very impactful, something in the quadrant on the right bottom, but very difficult to implement, or they find it's no impact, no importance, or feasibility, or low priority, and so on. So what we do with this data is a mixed method approach. We work with polygoning to do that. They plotted the ideas on the charts based on the perception of stakeholders on the average impact or feasibility score for each of these ideas. So what we are seeing here is also the color that they color-code in terms of group. So bear with me still a little longer. What we are going to present are the results on 4 policy options, and just leave things as they are. Age restriction, licensing, and ban high-THC products are not going to be presented. They got lower ratings in priority, in impact and feasibility. We won't address it at the time. It will be in our full report when it's delivered. It's also very interesting to read. So the do nothing got, can you see, like right outside there. It's very, very feasible. All stakeholders thought was, my God, this is so feasible. But actually do nothing for the impact. So that's what we found. When we look separately by each type of stakeholder, the 3 big buckets, cannabis industry thought it was also very easy to do, and also had impact. So for them, is in the go zone. When we go to the empower the general public, so there was empower the general public and empower the consumers with information. So they are all the same color. You can see that there was support, and they are firmly in the go zone, of educating in schools and community centers, earmark money, the tax for PSA, ads, and social media campaigns, explain the risk of high-potency products. And this was supported by all the 3 groups pretty much equally. They moved a little bit around, but they were in the same go zone firmly. What about empower the consumers with information? What kind of ideas were that? So, and it was mentioned here already. So first, place public health messages at point of sale. Put warning labels specific to high potency products. Make the labels readable. What a thought. Like try to make them in font sizes that are readable with contrast colors and placement. More precisely, this was an idea of doing research to determine this, to putting labels. So all of these were in the goes on to, supported by most of stakeholders. There was also an idea a little outside that posting store warning about high-THC products, and the idea of ADAI would be the education that would do, like maintain things as they are, but just teach moderation. ADAI will do. Community and professions were not that jazzed about this last idea and put it outside the goes on, but it was still endorsed when you look at the total amount of people, with the industry supporting it. What about advertising restrictions? See, another color, other numbers. Advertising restrictions, we got, 3 of them in the goes on. The first one is in the go zone, probably for a very easy reason to understand, because it's already enforced and is already true in our state. So ban high-THC ads on billboards is already banned, as most of us probably know. In billboards, we cannot have any pictures or signs or graphics of any cannabis product for that matter. Restrict where cannabis advertising of high products is allowed was also endorsed, and eliminate all advertising of high THC products was also in the go zone when you see all the stakeholders together. When we look separately to the different stakeholders, the cannabis industry got the 12, eliminate all advertising on high THC products, so I should say cannabis industry and consumers, not that far from the go zone, but a little far removed from the go zone. Purchase and caps, purchase and product caps, which has been discussed throughout the day today and has been proposed twice in Washington State legislative process. They were mostly, ideas around was mostly situated on the no-go zone or the discard zone. We did have 3 ideas here that were in the consider zone, meaning they were considered impactful, but just wondering about the feasibility. So first was cap THC by product category, so by flower, by concentrates, cap THC concentration at 10% total THC. And we wanted just to mention the limit serving size to 5 milligrams in all products, or limiting to 10 milligrams were on the discard zone for Washington State stakeholders at this point in time. When we look at different stakeholders, we could see that professionals were definitely more excited and moved to the go zone, capping THC products by category. What about taxation? So we spread all over, but we had one idea that was in the go zone, that is increase taxes on products with more than 35% THC. What is interesting to note here, also very close, increase taxes on products thought to be harmful, and tax based on total THC by weight, that is very frequently proposed, was outside the go zone. Not too far from it, but was outside. What I think is important to see on this is how different stakeholders vary in terms of their support of taxation. In terms of community, and the 3 buckets, they pretty much look like I'm presenting here. But if you look at cannabis industry and professionals, you can see that cannabis industry situated any taxation that means increasing taxation in the remove option, while professionals put it on the go zone. So strong support for increasing taxes from the professionals, zero support from the industry at this point in time. The cannabis industry supported 40, the idea 40, that was actually decreased taxes if you add CBD or CBG to their products. So this is our findings so far. We are not doing editorial comment about them, except that at this point in time, this is due to legislators on the end of the year. I would like to mention the policy implications. So first, good news from those that are rallying for population health in Washington State. Stakeholders are concerned with high THC products for non-medical use, and they support policy changes. Some of the policies supported are in fact backed by science and research. That is the case of consumer empowerment, like adding health warning labels and making the labels readable. Having advertising ban specifically for these products, and a tax increase proportional to THC content or concentration for non-medical use. Of course, there were also several other options that are backed by science that were not supported by Washington stakeholders at this time, probably suggesting the importance of doing more consumer and public education on these matters. I want to finish acknowledging the study participants that kindly participated in our study. The project advisory group members of our work, namely Jacob Delbridge, Dr. Kevin Hargody, Dr. Gillian Schauer, Dr. Mike McDonough, and Maga Moore. Thanks for all your thoughts and support. To Polygon Incorporated, the team, the company that supported the concept analysis process that we use in this study, and also to Dr. Cashlin First, that first introduced us to the idea of working with stakeholders using concept mapping. So I think I used less of my time, but I can tell some story if you want. So I would like now to start our Q&A, and I want to introduce Dr. Marina Epstein. She is a research scientist that works at Social Development Research Group, SDRG, at the School of Social Work, and kindly agreed to help us on our Q&A today. Come on in.
Can we bring Dr. Hall back?
Yeah, we were able to bring this in the morning. Can somebody check? He's out.
Oh.
Okay.
Great.
Hello.
I just want to say what a great panel, and thank you for everyone who stuck around. Yeah, we have a number of really interesting questions. Some are more involved, some are less, so I think panel members take those as you will. I'm going to start with just a clarification one for Dr. Carlini on your study. When you were asking your participants about the feasibility, were you presenting feasibility as just, interpreted as you will? Or is it political feasibility, or is it implementation feasibility, or did you let them kind of decide what kind of feasibility they thought?
Thanks, excellent question. We clearly asked them to not consider political feasibility, but to think, if this were to be approved by political process, do you think it's feasible to implement? So that was the question. Whether or not people took that at heart is a different issue. We could notice that a lot of the comments there were about considerations of the political feasibility.
Great, thank you. And then next question, another quick one maybe, is for Dr. Schauer. A couple of people asked about you to say a little bit more about the potential problems with Illinois taxing approaches.
Yeah, so I'm channeling the Illinois regulator, and they've recently had a changeover in their regulator, but because they have a tiered system, they have 3 different potential taxes to collect at every every sales encounter. And to make sure that people are doing that right, they'd really need an enforcement scheme where people are going in to make sure, well, was this really an edible, or was this a concentrate? Was this flower a type of flower that's infused that we would actually call an edible? So there's a lot of tax detail there where that sort of a tax scheme would just need to be accompanied by some enforcement to ensure the certainty of tax collection at the point of sale, and also some training, because at the point of sale it can be difficult to make those decisions.
Thank you. And I guess to continue with you, Dr. Schauer, would you talk a little bit about the additives to e-liquids, and how much do we understand about what goes into the e-liquids, and how much of that is and isn't harmful? So when you talked about, the caps on, in one of the states, Connecticut maybe, on vapes, and that if the cap was set to 60%, what is the other 40% going to be filled with?
Yeah, so interestingly, both Connecticut and Vermont have exempted vape cartridges. And again, I am not in the legislature there, I can't channel them, but my guess is that they were thinking carefully about the vaping lung injury outbreak. So what we know from the vaping lung injury outbreak is THC was not responsible for the effects that were seen. We also know that vitamin E acetate was one cause, but CDC was very careful in their wording to not rule out other potential causes. I've worked closely with laboratorians from across the spectrum, from government, from states, talked with industry lab folks as well. We have very little understanding of the effects of the different additives being used in cannabis vape cartridges and what happens when they're aerosolized. And I think we have a lot more to learn there. Typically, this is an area where a federal agency like FDA would be weighing in to give you safety profiles, to help regulators make sense of what, are there any terpenes that are of concern? Are there any excipients or diluents? And, what are the concerns? Is it around heat? Do you need to change the device? Those are conversations that every state has been left to have on their own, and it's been extremely challenging. And we see a number of states banning different additives, but it's based on their own sort of sense within the state, and we don't see consistency across the state either. So I've spoken with some lab folks that I trust deeply who have told me personally their estimation is that the safest vape product would be one that's as pure in cannabinoid content as you can get. And if you're concerned about having a 99% THC vape cartridge, then you look at other policies. You could limit the serving size, you could limit the purchase amount, but to have a cap on that, I feel personally raises some public health concerns because of how little we know about additives and how little regulation is possible because of our lack of knowledge there.
If you'll allow me to put you on the spot just for 1 second, I study e-cigarettes, which are, we don't have the same national ban on, but there's the same questions about what is in those e-liquids. And have we learned, do you know anything if we've learned from that industry about what is and isn't safe?
It's very hard to translate the additives being used in nicotine vape devices to the additives being used in THC vape devices because nicotine is liquid soluble and THC is fat soluble. And so that makes for a whole different array of additives that potentially are more concerning for the kinds of things like E-Valley because it's a fat soluble substance at present.
Great, thank you. A question to Dr. Walker. Why do you think there isn't more awareness of the relationship between psychosis and cannabis, especially among this young adult population? And how can we use new or existing, networks that like the technical prevention centers and clinician educations, and how can we use resources to make sure that that information is getting out there for this population?
That's a great question. I think that
mic doesn't work.
Does it not work? Perfect. Okay. I think that one reason why people don't really understand the relationship, or it hasn't gotten a lot of press, is that, the population base rates of psychosis are very low, It used to be pre a high level or high potency THC, about 0.5% of people, might experience that in their lifetime. Now it's up to about 1%. So I think people, there's maybe a little hesitancy around making a lot out of something that doesn't necessarily affect a huge amount of people. But I also think I had a thought, and it was, where was it? I think initially when some of the findings were coming out around psychosis and cannabis, it felt a little bit like cannabis hysteria, from the olden days. And there, I think, were a lot of critics that looked really, intensely at that data and wondered, about if this was a causal relationship. And I think that conversation still is going on, although I think the data really is kind of falling more on the side of there is some kind of causal connection there. And as far as, I think we do need to use the existing provider networks that we have to get this information out. I think the provider community in psychosis is pretty well connected as well, and so I think this, there needs to be actual curriculum, I think, within psychosis programming for providers and for families and also patients.
Thank you. I really appreciate you making the distinction between the general population and the risk for psychosis at the general population versus the risk of recurrence or, inciting psychosis or rehospitalization among the population that has already been diagnosed, that those are slightly separate issues that sometimes get crossed over.
A comment on this particular topic? Well, just to make the point, can you hear me? I think in the US the phrase reefer madness is sort of a Trumpian phrase that's used to shut down any discussion of this topic. And there's a lot of mythology about reefer madness being a government propaganda film when it wasn't, and it was basically an exploitation film that I've recently published on. But it's just a phrase that people use to avoid discussing the evidence, and I think the evidence is very clear, and it's been well accepted in most places other than the US. And I think certainly it's true, the population prevalence is fairly low, but I think one message that's important to get across is if you've got a family member, a first degree relative who's affected, you've got about tenfold increased risk to begin with. And if you're doubling or trebling that risk by being a heavy cannabis user, then your risk sort of is getting up into the sort of range of 30% or thereabouts. And that's a message that really needs to be got out there clearly, regardless of whether cannabis is legal or not in a state.
Dr. Hall, and I actually have a follow-up question for you, not follow-up to this necessarily, but would you talk a little bit about, you mentioned, who does the burden of proof of showing the harm of high-potency THC products should be on? Is it the industry, and can we trust the industry? Is it the policymakers? Is it the professionals? Is it the researchers? You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, look, I think that's important. It's remarkable how the burden has implicitly shifted to the public health community to demonstrate that consuming more potent products is probably not a good idea. There's enormous double standards that operate in the area of benefits and harms of cannabis that we've seen in the US. People prepared to assume or to infer that medical cannabis reduces opioid overdose deaths on the basis of ecological correlations, but reject much stronger evidence, epidemiological evidence of the sort that we've heard presented today on cannabis and psychosis. So I think the burden of proof ought to be on the industry, as I think Bea and others have pointed out. People didn't vote for cannabis extracts and concentrates when they voted to legalise marijuana, which was the herbal product. And I think the industry really needs to be demonstrating that these products that they're now developing and promoting don't increase the risks of some of the adverse effects that have been demonstrated for even the older herbal cannabis products.
One of the conversations I was having during one of the breaks is that the enforcing that burden of proof is usually the job of the FDA, which of course is not involved in this case because we don't have a national, we have a national ban.
US, Mark Kleiman, the late great Mark Kleiman made the point that the US has the worst of both worlds in the fact that you've got federal prohibition and state legalization, that the sort of federal agencies that should be doing all of these, providing information on these issues is just kept out of the equation and not allowed to participate. And the sooner the US gets around to national legalization, or at least removing cannabis from the Controlled Substances Act, better, I think, to allow a lot of these issues to be better addressed by research.
Yeah, I'm sure that point is widely shared in this room. A question for Dr. Carlini. Would you talk about some efforts that they're being made by the UW to collaborate or partner or at least have conversations with the industry on conducting some of the research that is missing?
Good question as well. Yeah, there are many opportunities to do research, and there are many things missing. We, as a university, are bound to the federal laws of collaboration, of doing research, and that is mostly the challenge of collaborating on answering some of these questions with the industry. We cannot touch research-wise the products that they offer in the market as much as we would like to do research with it, and we congratulate Dr. Carrie Cutler on having creative ideas of how to develop these protocols. So this is important and it should be addressed. I know of colleagues that work on the medicinal side on developing, Dr. Nafistella is here, that do research on the medicinal side and work with the substance provided by the University of Mississippi, that is the DAA approved material. But for studying the impact of the products that are out there, we are pretty limited. So yeah, so I do talk to the industry, and we collaborate when possible on exchanging ideas, on disseminating and opening doors. I also am very aware that although some of them are my dear estimate colleagues and even friends, we do sit in different sides of the interest. So the industry by nature, that's how they make their living. They have interest on profiting on the products that I'm most concerned about. So that doesn't mean make me a person that is on reefer madness, or them as people that don't have principles, but very different on that, but we are definitely sitting in different sides, so our questions may differ as well. I invite the industry to do the research to prove their products are safe for consumption. As Dr. Hall was saying, it's complicated for us to have to prove that their products are not safe and be questioned all the time in terms of our methodology or a lack of certainty, and that's, for you guys, that's doing science. It takes 40 years to be certain of something, and we may change our certain in the next day because we don't have really any skin in the game. We are open to the truth as the truth evolve. So we are sitting different sides, and I truly respect my friends and colleagues from the industry. They're just aware of where we sit.
Thank you. And I think it's also interesting that your studies show that on certain issues, it's not just the industry, the consumers and the industry are very aligned, you know, especially on things like costs.
Yeah, the consumers, yeah, it should be, but not as removed from concern as the industry is.
Right, agreed. Dr. Hall, you drew several parallels in your talk between how we regulate cannabis and how we regulate alcohol. And I think it's really interesting to consider. In this state, when we privatized alcohol, we raised taxes on alcohol in 2011 or something like that. The use of alcohol went straight up. And
Same election where we legalized cannabis, we privatized alcohol.
Right. And so I think we should take all the lessons that we have learned from alcohol, but also take all the lessons that we've learned from alcohol that just increasing prices may or may not move the needle. Do you think there are other ways that we could capitalize on lessons learned from alcohol restriction and on alcohol harm reduction that could be used here?
I mean, don't just limit it to alcohol. I mean, I think there was a paper that Rosalie Pakula was first author on that was published, must be getting on for 8 or 9 years ago, the American Journal of Public Health, which nicely drew out a lot of the parallels between the regulation of alcohol and tobacco and potential lessons for cannabis regulation. I mean, certainly taxes is one way of doing it, but it's a fairly blunt instrument. And I think a lot of it has to do with what sorts of promotional activities are allowed, with where retail outlets are located, with trading hours, with public education. And I think that's going to be a struggle, given the sort of history that we've had with the alcohol and tobacco industries in undermining public health education campaigns about the risks of their products. But I think we certainly should be looking at that, and we should be calling the industry on it, because they're always arguing we should regulate cannabis like alcohol. And that's sort of opening the door to learning or benefiting from a lot of the lessons from the history of alcohol policy.
Thank you. Dr. Schauer, it was a question about what policy have you seen that has had the largest impact on youth-related cannabis use and other issues?
I feel like that's me responding to a question about a presentation I didn't give, because I have a whole list of other things to say about youth cannabis prevention. But the truth is, we haven't generally seen youth use of cannabis increase in states that have legalized adult use. In fact, recently, Colorado actually saw a decrease. But I do think that, it was talked about today, this idea that a lot of states have a provision that products should not appeal to kids. And I think any regulator would tell you that that's extremely hard to enforce. It's very subjective. Those policies detail occasionally things like color or font or cartoon, but they, even in defining them, still leave a lot of room open for subjectivity. And so I think one approach that we are seeing some states try is plain packaging, which was talked about by Dr. Hammond, and a number of medical states have plain packaged products that removes the potential of the exterior of the product to appeal to kids. We recently have seen Connecticut try to implement plain packaging on the adult use end. Their statute actually called for plain packaging across the board, and they received some pushback, and I believe they will only be rolling out plain packaging for edibles. They preserved edibles in part because of all the poison center data that you saw presented today, where kids can find products that look appealing, open them, and consume them. So I think there's a lot of work to do there, and I didn't have a chance to talk about the hemp side of the house, but a lot of the products that we see in the news that look like common commercial goods are not from regulated cannabis markets. They're from the hemp marketplace. And underscoring everything we've talked about today is the fact that on a wholly different marketplace that's regulated in a very different way right now, particularly in our state, you can find high THC products. You can find products that appeal to kids. So I think that needs to be part of a discussion. I know it's outside of the scope of the work ADAI is doing, but that is an area that certainly is ripe for the kind of discussions we're having today.
There was a question about it was hemp-derived THC products specifically, so maybe you could explain to folks what that is and how it happens. Yeah, so there are two main issues with hemp. One is that CBD is being turned into a range of other cannabinoids, some of which are impairing, delta-8, delta-10, HHC, THCO acetate. That's one issue. That's through a chemical process that's being achieved. The other issue, though, is that the Farm Bill defined hemp as products with 0.3% THC at a dry weight level. And in plant, 0.3% THC is not a lot of THC. So that's probably what they may have been thinking about when they passed the Farm Bill. But in food and beverage, 0.3% is a lot. And suddenly a fun-sized pack of gummies that your kids might get while trick-or-treating, so envision that. That type of product on the hemp marketplace can have 60 milligrams of THC. So you start to look at chocolate bars, and you're quickly looking at products that can legally have more delta-9 THC on the hemp marketplace than we currently allow in the adult use marketplace. So that's where I think this discussion about high THC products, it must encompass some discussion about the hemp industry, or we're leaving open opportunities for those types of products to exist in one market and not in another highly regulated market. Thank you. One final question for Dr. Walker. Have you seen any benefits for patients in your studies in consuming high potency products? I mean, And maybe the answer is just an unqualified no, but.
Yeah, I haven't. Psychosis is a new area for me. So the last 20 years, we've been working in the general population, intervening for cannabis use disorders with adolescents and adults. The far majority of my work is just starting. We're starting to apply our interventions to this population and have talked with folks via that focus group data that I talked about. And yeah, I mean, I didn't really hear anybody talking about specifically high potency THC being beneficial to them. And the literature seems pretty clear that it's not.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the panel. This is all the time that we have for questions.